Well, we left off after the 1848 election, and we talked about the Free Soil Party and the split of, Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats and abolitionists to create that party, and the whole conflict that was brewing over all the new territory that would eventually be New Mexico and Arizona and California and all that in the future, um, popular sovereignty and all that. But um, there will be another issue that will kind of bring this kind of fast track California's admission into becoming a state, and that was the 1848 discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill there near San Francisco. The 1848 discovery of gold just brought thousands of people to California by the end of 1849, and it obviously um, quickly increased not only people's desire to go there, but also it applying for statehood. And you know what that's going to mean. You're going to have an even more enhanced debate over slavery in the new territories because of this gold rush and because California and the people out there are going to want to um, have the state. Mining towns sprang up everywhere. San Francisco's population exploded. I mean, and some of the most lawless little shanty towns too. Wasn't much structure, wasn't much government violence, was rampant. So there was a good reason to kind of get a grip on things out there for at least have some type of structure. But it's interesting. James Marshall, who actually found the gold near Sutter's Mill, he tried to actually keep it a secret for a while, but I mean that's not going to happen. For You're not going to keep that secret for long because he wasn't alone whenever he found it. But the news of gold not only increased the desire to get to California and sped up the debate about whether to be a slave state or a free state, but it also opened up the desire to move west even further and faster. We'll talk about that during the so-called Gilded Age. But before leaving office, President Polk urged Congress to create territorial governments for California and New Mexico. Zachary Taylor hadn't quite taken the job yet. Again, and how these territories were going to be structured was going to again bring up the debate of slavery. And this is where Southerners are disappointed by Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor was from the South. He was a slave owner, which is why a lot of people in the South voted for him because they thought, well, he's one of us. He actually believed that the only way to avoid a fight in Congress was to have the people of California make their own decisions about slavery. And California, since they had enough people to skip the territorial stage, it could actually come and become a state. With Taylor's encouragement, California applied in December 49 for admission to the Union as a free state. So once again, as we go back to the gold rush sped up that process of California becoming a state. But Zachary Taylor wanted California to make up their own mind, and really he wanted California to come in as a free state. And this is where Southerners get irate. They're thinking, we voted for this guy, we thought he was one of us, and now he has let us down. And now we're going to go to one of the greatest debates in history over the so-called Compromise of 1850. If California entered the Union as a free state, the slaveholding states would become a minority in the Senate, therefore they'd have less representation and as far as making laws and stuff like that. So Southerners, of course, were scared about losing power in national politics, fearing it would lead to limits on slavery and states' rights and all that. So a few Southern politicians began talking openly of secession to take their states out of the Union. Now we're having a secession crisis, not just nullification anymore. Now we're talking openly of secession. So early in 1850, one of the most senior and influential leaders in the Senate, the great compromiser himself, Henry Clay of Kentucky, would try to mend these tensions once again with a compromise that would allow California to join the Union. This is why he got his name, the Great Compromiser, because of course, he played a vital role all the way back in the 1820 Missouri Compromise and the nullification crisis in 1833. So his initial propositions, he had 8 of them, and he had them in pairs. The first pair allow California to come in as a free state, but organize the rest of the Mexican cession without restrictions on slavery. Basically, they would kind of decide for themselves. The second pair settled the border dispute between New Mexico and Texas in favor of New Mexico. So Texas would have to give up a little bit of territory, but the federal government would repay Texas by taking on the state debts of Texas. This would hopefully win Southern votes for the compromise because, many Southerners held Texas bonds. Clay's third pair of resolutions outlawed the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but did not outlaw slavery itself. This would kind of appease both sides. The abolitionists got the slave trade eliminated, but slavery didn't totally go away in the practice, so that would kind of appease Southerners. Now, the final two resolutions were concessions completely to the South. Congress would be prohibited from interfering with domestic slave trade and would pass a new Fugitive Slave Act to help Southerners recover enslaved African Americans who fled to free territories. Now, these concessions were necessary to ensure obviously the South wouldn't secede once California joined the Union as a free state. But obviously, this was just the beginning of the debate. These were just Henry Clay's initial proposals. So the massive debate, of course, was response from who else? John C. Calhoun, once again. He was the great defender of states' rights for the South. And of course, he was actually, at this point, he was too sick to address the Senate, so he composed a speech that he actually had somebody recite for him. Anyway, his reply to Henry Clay's proposal was basically pretty frank. It stated that Northern agitation against slavery basically threatened to destroy the South. He didn't think Henry Clay's compromise would save the Union, which he was right about that. It would only temporarily kick the can down the road, as we'll see. The South needed an acceptance of its rights, the return of fugitive slaves, and a guarantee of balance between the sections. So he was wanting to kind of continue to maintain a balance in Congress of free and slave states. He wanted to guarantee a fugitive slave law, and that Southerners could take their slaves wherever they wanted to. But that was just John C. Calhoun's proposal. A couple of days later, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts responded to Calhoun, his open talk, calling the Senate to put national unity above sectional loyalties. Webster talked about he was throwing his support behind Henry Clay's plan, claiming that it was the only hope for preserving the Union. And although he wanted conciliation, Webster did not back away from speaking bluntly with chilling foresight. And I quote, "I wish to speak today not as a Massachusetts man or a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for preservation of the Union. Hear me for my cause. There can be no such thing as peaceable concession. Peaceable secession. Peaceable secession is an utter impossibility. I see as plainly as I see the sun in heaven what that disruption itself must produce, and it would be a war." So we are not quite compromised yet. But in the end of this debate, after other people came on, and you had William Seward, who we will hear more from in the future, came on and talked about it. We'll see Stephen Douglas and others. But anyway, Congress didn't pass Henry Clay's first proposed bill. In part because President Taylor opposed it, but then Zachary Taylor died in office that summer. He actually, on a 4th of July celebration, contracted some kind of a stomach disorder and passed away. He drank a bunch of cherries and milk and raw vegetables. It could have been that, could have been a disease. We're not real sure. 19th century medical records aren't exactly the best in the world. But here's what kind of changes things. Vice President Millard Fillmore succeeded him. He quickly threw his support behind the compromise. So Fillmore hoped to just kind of avoid a crisis by, supporting Clay's compromise, but we still weren't done yet. Calhoun passed away, and Daniel Webster became the Secretary of State. So 37-year-old Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois divided the large compromise into even more several smaller bits. And here was the final compromise. California would be admitted to the Union as a free state, which would obviously be a victory for the North. Popular sovereignty would be extended to the Utah and New Mexico territories, kind of a moderate win for both sides. The Texas border dispute would be resolved. Texas would give up some of its territory to create New Mexico, but Texas would get $10 million. So that's kind of a moderate Southern victory. That's kind of a balance. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, would be abolished from Washington, D.C. So it's kind of a little bit of a Northern victory. And there would be a Fugitive Slave Act implemented. There's your Compromise of 1850. And so it's just a whole litany of things to kind of, for a little while anyway, to stave off another war. So for a short time, the Compromise of 1850 eased the tensions over slavery. But in the next few years, the hope of a permanent solution of compromise would fade out. Obviously, we would see the Kansas-Nebraska crisis. You would see just fierce opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act. Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes her Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the Republican Party is created on stopping the expansion of slavery. Southerners are hell-bent and determined that party is determined to end slavery. And then when Lincoln gets elected president, we actually have a Republican president. They start seceding. So the Compromise of 1850 kind of put a bandage on the growing crisis, but it certainly didn't stop the inevitable conflict that we're about to see.